So, good evening, everybody. Summer is over. In Berlin, it's quite winterish, actually, quite coldish. I'm very happy to be back. I missed the August and September session because I was on holiday, so I'm excused. I'm very, very happy to be back and to introduce Monica Luci. Can I say that we are colleagues, but we are also friends, Monica?
Yes, you can.
Okay, that's good. Before I introduce Monica to you, although you know her, the next 2 months before Christmas are going to be very hot, although outside is going to be very cold, well, depending where you are from. In 1 month, on the 11th of November, Joe Cambray is with us. 1 week after, Sono Shamdasani will talk about the Black Books. On the 18th of November, don't miss it because it's free of charge. Usually, all the other appointments are not free of charge. And in December, we have Nancy Krieger. So I'm very happy that Nancy is also with us tonight. I'm very happy to introduce Monica for different reasons. For me, Monica is one of the most interesting under 50 Jungians, from the clinical point of view and also as a scholar. She wrote this book in 2017, Torture, Psychoanalysis, and Human Rights. It's not an easy read, but it's worth to read it. Her latest work, and I'm happy that Liz is with us, is contained in this book, published by Routledge a couple of months ago, edited by Elizabeth Brodersen and Pilar Amenazaga. Here, she wrote with many, many other interesting Jungian analysts and young and Jungian analysts. She wrote about crossing physical borders and the making of identity in the case of Europe. So Monica is a very good clinician, is a very good scholar. She's very shy, so I'm sure she hates me right now. Plus, she is a former student of Essex University, and she's part of what I call the Essex School. The Essex School that was started by Andrew Samuel, who is here, and Renos Papadopoulos. Let's see what will happen with these PhD students and former students of the Essex School. And maybe she's also part of the Italian Nouvelle Vague in analytical psychology. Now I stop. The floor is for you, Monica.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for this very nice and personal presentation. I'm reading that it's a kind of something that you do normally, that people read in their own native language. Is that correct?
Is this a question for me?
Yes, it is for you, Stefano.
Yes, more or less. It depends.
More or less. Okay. Okay. Maybe it's a good thing to do it if it is possible. Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. So I feel less lonely. I mean, here speaking alone. So, buonasera, benvenuti. I will start. Grazie per essere qui. Can you reactivate the audio, Paul?
I'm sorry. We tend to mute everyone except you and Stefano. So
Okay.
You are audible, but no one else is, but they're all here. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay. So I will go with my talk. Well, I thought of this talk about the coronavirus pandemic, which is something that we are living together. And I prepared a presentation, a slide presentation that is just a sequence of images that goes with the flow of my talk. I hope this helps to follow in my talk and to enjoy my discourse. Can you, Paul, help me with that? In the past months, the lockdown and the following social distancing measures implemented in the most diverse ways all around the world due to the coronavirus pandemic was perhaps the biggest natural social experiment we all could witness. During the peak of the pandemic, we had to restructure our living space and habits in order to be safe. An ancient social measures against contagion. As a consequence, we experienced a radical change that reshaped our experience in family, at work, in relationships, in the way of getting in touch with each other, in the way of carrying out daily activities with differentiated but certain impact on our lives. So a question that has been haunting me since the beginning is, what exactly are we living? It seems to me we lived and are still living an exceptional experience that illuminates on something very ordinary, so ordinary that it goes unnoticed. The water in which we, the fishes, swim. Just to recall something about our common experience of the past months, what comes to my mind is retreat, separation, solitude, limited movement, fear, sense of threat, but also will to help, a vivid sense of communion with the national community, sometimes relief when liberated from burdens of undesired commitments, but also feeling on the edge of a breakdown, panic, helplessness, and much more. During daily life, emphasis all the time fell on borders, on the line between inner and outer, clean and dirty, virus-free and potentially infected surfaces and rooms, sanitized environments and potentially contagious ones. After the end of lockdown, people, especially in some countries and culture, had to relearn how to greet and to meet without touching and kissing and keeping a distance from the others, how to avoid group life as a form of care for group life or family life, avoiding gatherings of whatever nature, wearing masks, get used to plastic barriers in offices, in restaurants, and our patients were not allowed to attend our therapy rooms and were moved to a remote online work. Even children were painfully protected, avoiding too much bodily contact. And then we relearned how to move, where to go and not to go, what to do, what to wear, how to protect ourselves. Basically, a daily training for our embodied beings and for our minds. A training that, in combination with the restructuring of our living space, I argue tonight, has the potential to restructure ourselves. Especially in the days of lockdown, at least some of us could feel sharply and painfully how interwoven we are with the environment we inhabit, and how much in relation to a human and non-human environment our being is. Our psyche seems to be intermingled with the outer space of our cities and countries, buildings and natural environment, as much as with other human beings. If this was not the case, perhaps it wouldn't exist poetry, dreams, and scent play therapy. Some of Jung's autobiographical episodes and alchemic studies provide illuminating insights on the relevance of this interconnection. In Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Jung writes about the resonances between himself and the environment. The second slide, Paul, please. He writes, "At times I feel as if I'm spread out over the landscape and inside things, and I'm myself living in every tree, in the splashing of the waves, in the clouds, the animals that come and go, in the procession of the seasons. There is nothing in the tower that has not grown into its own for over decades, nothing in which I'm not linked. Here everything has its history and mine. Here is space for the spaceless kingdom of the words and the psyche's hinterland." If psychoanalysis has consolidated the knowledge about the ways we are shaped by our relational human environment, I will try here to give a brief overview of the theories that somehow recognize the psychic fact that there are exchanges and a mutual constitution between oneself and the non-human environment, its space and its objects. I divided this brief overview in theories of space and theories of boundaries. Next slide. About theories of space, Harold Sears, for example, was convinced that the non-human environment has a great psychological meaning. In the preface of the non-human environment in normal development and in schizophrenia, he writes, "Life's meaning resided not only in my relatedness with my mother and father and sister and other persons, but in relatedness with the land itself. The verdant or autumn tapestried or stark and snow-covered hills, the uncounted lakes, the rivers." Sears indicated the non-human world makes significant contribution to healthy development, providing a sense of stability and continuity of experience, a practice ground in which to develop useful capacities and a sense of being part of the natural world. Next slide. The second psychoanalytic author who paid unusual attention to the environment is, of course, Donald Winnicott. Winnicott works as both a pediatrician and psychoanalyst in a hospital in the impoverished East End of London, surely brought him into close contact with harsh environmental realities. He refers to overcrowding, starvation, infestation, the constant threat from the physical disease and disaster, and from the laws as the common persecutions. Winnicott noted both objective external reality and inner psychic reality. He was the first theorist to use the term nurturing environment and holding environment, referring it to the mother and the bond between mother and baby. When the mother fades, as ordinarily happens, the infant must seek soothing elsewhere and ordinarily encounters a useful inanimate object in the environment, such as a blanket or a soft toy, the transitional object. Also, Christopher Bollas points out that visual and nameless forms that establish familiarity and consistency exist in a proverbial world of signs, senses, smells, affinities that constitute life in the maternal order. According to him, when we project aspects of ourselves into an object, we receive in return those characteristics of the object's structural forms or function that resonate with our unconscious needs at the time. It turns such a merger, uncanny fusion, and an intimate rendezvous. Slide. Jung both theorized and lived this idea of an exchange between inner and outer world, between subjects and objects. In terms of theory, in analytical psychology, the term states of identity or participation mystique denotes unconscious conformity between subject and object, oneself and others, between the individual and the environment, without awareness of being in such a state. And it promotes changes through a breakdown of structures that is essential to personality change. Jung experienced firsthand this compulsive tie between self, objects, and space. Think of his famous dream of the house as his self. Slide. Or the personal experience of building the tower at Bollingen. Jung's subjective account illustrates perfectly this experience of identification with the house, its containing forms, and experience himself as if merged with it and inscribed by it. And this account of alchemy too, as a projection of alchemist unconscious contents into the matter. Their effort was to bring unity from disparate parts of the psyche, creating a chemical wedding. More recently, Luci Askinson, with outstanding research about analytical psychology and architecture, states, by projecting our psyche into space, we create ourselves as subjects who feel at home in the world. Slide. A set of theorists called Theorists of Boundaries investigated how our intrapsychic apparatus allows connecting matter and psyche through a sort of contact barrier between internal and external worlds. They contributed to construct the concept of psychic skin. Sigmund Freud laid the ground for such a concept, declaring that the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego, a mental projection of the surface of the body. Esther Big continued his work discussing the crucial role of the skin for binding together the infant sensation and enabling it to overcome the catastrophic anxieties that otherwise arise from its unintegrated state. Significant for our investigation is Big's suggestion that any object, including non-human object, can facilitate the infant's containment. Although the touch of the mother's skin is, of course, the optimal object, any non-human object is capable of holding the infant's attention with suffice. The psychoanalyst Didier Anzier developed similar ideas to Big. According to Anzier, before the development of the thinking ego, as he terms it, the infant depends on something called a skin ego, which performs through various primitive functions the tasks that will eventually be performed by the cognitive ego. The skin ego is not available to the infant from the beginning, but is gradually achieved in response to stimuli impinging on the surface of its skin. Also, Bion developed a paradigm in psychoanalysis in terms of the containing function, which can be thought as a psychic envelope and elements that are contained. So, containing function and things that are contained. Beta elements are primitive elements, a thing in itself, which must be evacuated, a priori incapable of being assimilated by infant mind. The capacity of the container to contain these elements enables them to become mentally experienced by the infant. Thomas Ogden extends Klein's developmental model by adding to her paranoid, schizoid, depressive position a third one, called the autistic contiguous position, understanding the immense importance of the skin. The autistic contiguous position is associated with a mode of generating an experience that is of sensation-dominated sort, not only tactile, but sights, sound, and smells, characterized by proto-symbolic impressions of sensory experience that together help constitute an experience of bounded surfaces. Slide. If the individual psyche, okay, you can go on, Paul. Yes, these are images that are evocative, in my opinion, of what we have been talking. Okay, you can stop here. Thank you, Paul. If the individual psyche is in relation not only to its human environment, but also to the non-human environment, we can state that even more so can be said for group life. So not only for individual psychic life, but for group life. Think of the sacred tie of a national group to the land, and the two world wars in 20th century, or the erection of monuments and collective symbols everywhere in the world. Think of the defense of territories from invasions of any sort, real or hallucinated, by a national or ethnic group in our time and in every time. The concept of group psychic skin is less theorized and less well-defined, but still there are authors who dealt with it in some way, in some interesting way. For example, Vamik Volkan, next slide, very effectively describes the importance of group skin using the metaphor of a large canvas tent to explain large group identity. Volkan supposes the existence of individual and group identities as different coexisting layers. He compares it to our wearing two layers of clothing from the time we are children. The first layer, the individual layer, fits each of us snugly. The second layer, one's core large group identity, is loose-fitting, but allows us to share a sense of sameness with others under a common large group tent. So these two layers are interconnected. Thomas Singer and Sam Kimball maintain that the capacity for a primary social skin function helps both the individual and groups in their evolution of identities in an ongoing process of formation and transformation. And groups have a particular type of skin function. The social skin, for example, can have different characteristics. It can be impermeable, rigid, or permeable. And this has an effect on the group ability to process group identity, with cultural complexes having a special role in this. Anzieu elaborated on the idea of a group need of containing boundaries. In his view, groups have or need a common skin, a containing envelope, which makes it possible for members to experience the existence of a group. The group is sensitive both to unconscious individual fantasies and to collective representations. He makes an insightful distinction about group skin between a real psychic group skin, an imaginary group psychic skin, and a symbolic group psychic skin. The real psychic group skin delimits group territory. This is, I find this distinction Anzieu does about the functions and the way the group psychic skin express itself very, very useful. He says, the real psychic group skin delimits a group territory, occupied space, time for the group, rhythm of the meetings. The imaginary group psychic skin corresponds to fantasies, illusions about the group envelope. It corresponds to organic metaphors in a language relative to the group and the experience of continuity with the skin. And then there is the symbolic group psychic skin, which includes signs and rituals pertaining to a sense of group belongingness. I think Anzieu tripartition identifies three modes of group functioning and three levels of group experience that correspond to Ogden's modes of psychic functioning: autistic contiguous, paranoid schizoid, and historical. The most elusive level and the most interesting level for us and the source of the genesis of group psychic skin is probably the first, the sensory ground of group identity, what draws and what anchors the sense of belonging of the group members to objects, spaces, and territories, and their entanglement with elements of place and materiality, a concrete group wrapper. Next slide. Let's think of Jung's visions and dreams that anticipated a big collective historical event, World War I, how that was expressed through sensory images of a group territory. I will read just a small part. I saw a monstrous flood covering all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. When it came up to Switzerland, I saw that the mountains grew higher and higher to protect our country. I realized that the frightful catastrophe was in progress. I saw the mighty yellow waves, the floating rubble of civilization, and the drowned bodies of uncounted thousands. Then the old sea turned to blood. If we accept that the individual and group self is made of physical and mental space and boundaries that are created in interaction with other selves and non-human environment, this also means that our sensory organs, the contact barrier between internal and external worlds, are the doors to enter ourself and to change it. This is how the environment and space can have an influence on our mind. Next slide, please. Here, I would like to develop an argument about the centrality of fear to move boundaries. Certainly, coronavirus time is the time of fear, individual and collective fears. I would like to develop an argument that fear is the central emotion through which the boundaries between an individual and its group are moved. And more precisely, in presence of fear, the boundaries of individual self are retracted, ceding space to the group needs. Whenever fear is powerful and becomes terror, complex systems collapse, and this collapse is experienced as a loss of individual and group boundaries. Terror is experienced as unbearable otherness, contact with the whole, and lost boundaries making arise the need of extruding what is alien to reinstate boundaries and ego function. It is difficult to deal with terror because it's a basic affect that is not easily described. Dread is nameless, as Bion effectively conveys. This expression describes the losing of any vestige of meaning because the incipient capacity to establish possible meaning has been reversed. When psychic pain is felt to be unheld and therefore unbearable, there may be fragmentation and withdrawal into closed-off states of petrified emotional isolation. A primary and fundamental and archetypal value can be recognized in the response of terror, in its being automatic, reflexive, immediate. While autistic contiguous experience is not just the realm of dread, but the most fundamental and primitive mode of being, it may become transformed into dread in an instant, as a feeling of leaking or dissolving, disappearing or falling into shapeless, unbounded space, pre-objectal life, the other within. This requires a new setting of borders. Often, this sense of other is easily evacuated into someone else, extruding from ourselves. This made me think of Jean Delumeau, the French historian that outlined the history of fear in the Western world in 13th, 19th century, when different kinds of fears were embodied and given shape through scapegoats, literally giving a body to social fears: Jews, women, witches, Turks, heretics, and so on. However, the social method to deal with dread is different for in-group and out-group people. Foucault explained this phenomenon very effectively through his distinction between ancient methods to address plague and leper, an analysis that is particularly keen to our experience of the coronavirus pandemic. Next slide, please. I'm quoting from the chapter Panopticism in Discipline and Punish. Foucault explained the way the towns of 17th century used to keep the plague under control. First, a strict spatial partitioning, the closing of the town and its outlying districts, a prohibition to leave the town on pain of death. The division of the town into distinct quarters, each governed by an intendant. Everyone is ordered to stay indoors. It is forbidden to leave on pain of death. The syndic himself comes to lock the door of each house from the outside. He takes the key with him and then it's over to the intendant of the quarter. The intendants keep it until the end of the quarantine. Each family will have made its own provisions. Basically, what we did. But for bread and wine, small wooden canals are set up between the street and the interior of the houses, thus allowing each person to receive his ration without communicating with the suppliers and other residents. If it is absolutely necessary to leave the house, it will be done in turn, avoiding any meeting. Only the intendants, syndics and guards will move about the streets. This makes me remind of the time of lockdown when just police was allowed to go around. It is a segmented, immobile, frozen space. This enclosed segmented space was observed at every point, of course, from power, in which the individuals are inserted in a fixed place, in which the slightest movements are supervised, in which all events are reordered, in which an interrupted work of writing links the center and periphery. Of course, he's writing about panopticism, in which power is exercised without division according to a continuous hierarchical figure, in which each individual is constantly located, examined, and distributed among the living beings, the sick and the dead. So the plague is met by order, and then he distinguishes the method to control the plague from the one adopted for the leper. The leper was caught up in a practice of rejection, of exile and closure. He was left in a mass among which it was useless to differentiate. The leper and his separation, the plague and its segmentation. The first is marked, the second analyzed and distributed. The exile of the leper and the arrest of the plague do not bring with them the same political dream, says Foucault. They are different projects, but not incompatible ones. Even today, trying to keep the pandemic under control, we are adopting the same methods. Segmentation and frozen spaces kept under control for in-group members, and differentiated forms of rejection for out-group people. It comes to my mind a recent news that reported of an unusual practice of deportation during the night of refugees that are positive to coronavirus from some Italian reception centers to a quarantine ship in Sicily, joining them with just arrived asylum seekers. A modern form of rejection. Italians' COVID-19 is addressed by order. Refugees' COVID-19 is addressed located them out of our land. Next slide, please. What will be of us? Of course, the threat posed by the coronavirus pandemic is ultimately the threat of death. And what's death? If not being extruded from one's own living space, from one's own human and non-human environment. Let's think for a brief moment of those who were suddenly hospitalized in intensive care units and didn't come back. Italian doctors to whom I had the chance to speak told that the most excruciating suffering for them was to empathize with these patients separated from families and homes in the most uncertain condition for their existence. They felt ethically engaged to them, aware that the most painful thing was not their physical suffering, but their emotional state, being scared certainly by the illness, but also by being severed by family and their living space. And some of these nurses and doctors made moving efforts to reconnect these patients with their life outside the hospital, through daily telephone contacts with families, through electronic means, celebrating birthdays on the ward, holding hands to those who died, aware that at that moment they were replacing wives, husbands, and children. And the most heartbreaking tale is about how painful it was for them after these deaths to save the personal effects of these persons, mostly watches and wedding rings and other personal objects, waiting for better times to return them to their families. Bodies, for obvious reasons, couldn't be returned, leaving families dealing with these ambiguous losses. And reflecting about these difficult and sometimes impossible mornings, What is mourning, if not the special way in which we accept that the loved one has passed to another, hopefully better place or world, with the flow of fantasies, rights, and imaginations, at the same time cultural, religious, and personal. A process of reconnecting them, at least in our mind, to a different environment, a different space. So even the most extreme events of this experience of pandemic show us that we are embedded in a matrix of conscious and unconscious link between our inner and outer worlds as individuals and group members, and that the environment, both human and non-human, we inhabit is invested of our conscious and unconscious thought. The pandemic, being a powerful and deep experience in which our living space is restructured by measures to avoid contagion, has the potential to make us more aware of these links. And it can also powerfully restructure ourselves, both as individual and group members, moving boundaries between individual and group, inner and outer, with potential threats and opportunities. On the side of threat, at individual level, this crisis is experienced as a radical state of danger, not just because it poses a mortal threat, but to a large extent also because the threat is undefined in terms of its scope, duration, methods of attack, and means of defense against it. Science is both the source of great hope and for some, and for many, disappointment. This is the most menacing combination for us, an external danger whose shape is not clearly delineated, which gives way to internal scenarios. Our inner demons will always be bigger and scarier than the external reality, both at individual and group level. Within us, they have no solid boundaries and no meaningful logic or language that we can hold on to. I couldn't but notice that among my patients, those suffering more were those who experienced in life boundary breaching through trauma and abuse. Why? I think because in confinement and social isolation, they experienced a return of their ghosts, a psychological condition in which they were weak, vulnerable, helpless, in a psychological ghetto with their abusers. A withdrawal of the boundaries of the self, I think, towards the small and isolated ego that made them feel more lonely and powerless, the victim of an internal abuser from which they couldn't be saved. At a collective level, I think we are more vulnerable to abuse and control by those who have political, economic, religious power. Our mind is more easily manipulated because prey of fear, that is the friend of any sort of splitting, and social defense mechanism easily slip into crimes against humanity. However, this pandemic is also an opportunity. This tiny, invisible enemy humans have now, the coronavirus, is forcing us to look at something we have been ignoring maybe for too long, putting an emphasis on the interconnection of our being and our psyche with the environment in which we live, and that supports both our material life and psychic life, and the opportunity to rethink our mutual dependence. For too long, we have been suffering because of our indifference towards boundaries that took on many different shapes: pollution, environmental disasters, excessive exploitation of natural resources, violence on ecological systems that alter the living system of animals and humans, with resulting dangerous mixture and or making them inhospitable, excessive consume of animals as food and consequent pollution and epidemics, violence on other human beings determining wars, massive flows of migration, and other ways. I agree with Antonio Karim Lanfranchi that some days ago wrote in a post, "The virus is confronting us with ourselves. How not to think of the beneficial effects of lockdown on Earth, on the quality of air, on plants and animals regaining their space in the natural environment, and even in our cities. We need to rethink our mutual dependence as human beings from our environment and the importance of conducting a life respectful of boundaries in any sense, but how to reestablish them and how to value our reciprocal interconnection are, of course, open questions. Okay, I'm stopping here because I know that I have time limits.
No, but don't worry about the time limit. Go on if you have to end it, or you have a few other remarks. Yeah.
Well, I think I have expressed, I supported my talk with feeling because, of course, it goes easier for a non-mother tongue like me, and because, I mean, I thought I had time limits that are more strict than maybe they are. But I would like to have some, you know, interaction, and
You want me
I really would prefer that.
Okay, so we open the floor to questions. Please send us questions through the chat. I have a question. You talked about the threat of death related to coronavirus. And I find it very interesting, although for me, and I've been saying this since March, because we both are Italian and Italy was the first country to be hit in Europe. It's about the threat of death or the threat of the suspension of certainties, the end of certainties we have been accustomed ourselves since the end of World War II. We don't know if we're going to celebrate Christmas with family. We didn't know if we're going to have holidays. These are somehow quite superficial questions, but this is, apart from the medical point of view, what many people are concerned with. So is it about the threat of the threat of death and the denial of everything is going on, or is it the threat of the suspension and the end of certainties?
Okay, shall I respond to this question? Or?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I think you are right. Meaning, what I understood, or the way I formulated in my mind the effect of these changes in our life due to the coronavirus pandemic is that we used, I mean, it changed the way we managed with our inner life and relational life. So basically, I'm not sure it is just the end of certainties. Of course, the certainties have their value, and but my idea is that it changed, you know, the way people, we, used to, to manage with their life. I mean, everyone has its own balance, made of many things and many people, many relationships, and all this changed. I mean, we were more isolated, even if technology, I mean, helps a lot to stay connected, to talk to people, but it's not, of course, the same thing. Our body is a bit sacrificed. You know, I think that our adjustment, the adjustment each of us found between inner world and outer world was completely overthrown. I mean, was completely upset, and the more people was counting on others, I think the more they are suffering now. I don't know if this makes sense. The meaning of my talk basically is we are not just living in our psyche, in our inner psyche. We are relying not only to other people, not only to relationships, but we are also relying on the environment, on the living space. We are moving, we are doing things, we are studying, we are talking to, we are living in all sense, I mean. And and we feel supported also by this environment, also the non-human environment. We feel supported by it, I think, because I discovered this with you know, with in a very sharp way when I first saw Rome completely empty. And I needed a paper to go around, like in Foucault description of the town, 17th century, struck by plague. And it was a mixture of something fascinating and scaring, very scaring.
Next question is from Leslie.
Yeah.
During lockdown, not only police, but food and services, delivery services operating, connecting individual with the public outer in functional way. How do those essential people, feeding people, etc., servicing the inner fit into group scheme? Frontline people in hospital nursing, are they facilitators of what? Psychologically fitting in somehow to group, linking in and out people consigned to being instrumental entities? Where are those people in terms of boundaries? Typical Leslie question.
It's very nice question.
Leslie style.
It's a very nice question. Yes, actually, I think she's right. I mean, I was at the time of lockdown, I was in a quarter of Rome, and there was a kind of service, self-organized service of people bringing food to, especially to elderly people, and I think they did a great job and a very useful service to the group spirit in a way. Exactly crossing, you know, doing this transit between inner and outer, bringing food from supermarkets to the houses of these elderly people. And so where are those people in terms of boundaries? I think they helped to keep these boundaries permeable in I think Feldman's terms. It's a Jungian author that used both Jungian thinking and object relation theories about psychic skin. So they help to keep these boundaries permeable, I think, because, you know, the panopticism is a kind of model structure that in my book I write that is a description of a monolithic self-state. So when the mind becomes fragmented in isolated, frozen pieces, and these pieces work like impermeable units. So I think they helped to to keep the group boundaries permeable. And so they helped a lot mental health. I mean, they were very useful to group life.
More questions? One from Paul. The focus on social connection that can be linked to client attachment, etc. But my experience of work has been somewhat more detached. HIV positive people in groups, analyses who are older and a bit alone, and the medical and military people I've thought of much for the past 6 months, people who are tougher about it. It's threat to social connection always more than threat to self? Is this cultural?
I'm not sure I got the point.
Paul, do you need to step in?
Apologies. Intuitive types asking questions and asking global questions. I'm thinking of what I've experienced as my own toughness, the toughness of some of the people around me, daily conversations of, oh, there are people who are really upset. We aren't, or I am not. And it will be often contexts where people are already not, can I say this in a way that doesn't sound problematic, already not deeply connected to a lot of other people. Mm-hmm. People who do not have family, people who do not, right? And many of my HIV positive colleagues and the people I've worked with are also somewhat isolated and somewhat less panicked. Yeah. Now that suggests that in comparison to what you're saying, I suppose I'm looking for a good or bad, right or wrong, better or worse. Is there such a thing, or would that be a mistake?
Paul,
I think. Sorry.
Time over, Paul.
Yes.
But I think I'm not sure if I'm getting the point, Paul. But I think the big difference is that this is a pandemic, and that is threatening everybody. Maybe it's different when the pandemic can be, sealed off in smaller boxes, and general population can feel safe or protected if blah 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 blah.
I know what you mean.
If it's not, or if it doesn't, or yeah.
I know what you mean. There's a traditional argument over you can't say the general population, but I know what you mean. This is something.
Yes, and I understand what you mean. The saying about general population, I agree.
Guys, I am the moderator. Paul, mute yourself, please. Andrew, you are muted. You want to ask your question live?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just going to read it, actually, from the chat. Monica, yes, you can see it yourself too. Yeah. What I found innovative and original in your paper was that you covered positive and benign containment, holding boundaries, together with negative and oppressive aspects.
Yeah.
So, unusually, you did not divorce the nurturing environment on the one hand from panopticons, prisons, lockdown anxiety, and solipsism on the other hand. Actually, this is also a point for therapy, as well as about the psychopolitics of COVID-19.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for highlighting this point. Actually, I think it is a matter of intensity of fear and threat, meaning that, of course, boundaries are what contain us and what divide us from the other. what contain us and what connect us to the other, and what can divide us from the other. So it's both. And yeah, it's also a point for therapy, of course. It's a point for therapy. It's a very important point for therapy. What my fantasy, because I don't know if I'm getting, I mean, I don't know if I'm right, if I'm getting the point precisely, but my understanding is that, it's like a play or a dance between individual and group boundaries, and how much space we cede to group need, how much permeable or impermeable we are as individuals. And yes, it's a very, I mean, I could draw it. Next time I will do some funny drawings. Yeah.
Monica, do you have energy for last question?
Yeah.
From Ian, can you speak to the benefits to the climate of the slowing down of economies?
Mm-hmm. This is a difficult.
It's short but difficult.
It is a difficult question. I think that I'm doing a strong declaration. I mean, I have a fantasy that this, tragedy for humanity is a kind of way nature is rebalancing our, excessive activity, our, being hyperactive. And I think economy has much to do with that. Our model of development and economic models have much to do with that. So I think it's a way, I mean, the virus is slowing us, is stopping us in our houses, is making our travels less frequent. I mean, in a way, nature is speaking loudly and clearly, unfortunately. But maybe, I mean, the sense of my conclusions was maybe we did too much, and we breached too much boundaries in any sense. And the result was a big mixture that made the old mess. I'm referring to the virus passing from animals to humans.
Monica, I'm happy we invited you. I'm happy we came here to listen to you. And thank you. Thank you on behalf of everyone else. And I hope to talk to you soon again, but especially to meet you again.
Thank you for having invited me, and thank you all for having had the patience to listen to me. And thank you for questions.
Ciao Monica, grazie.
Ciao, ciao, a presto.
Good night everyone. Good night and good luck.